Next to give evidence to our lockdown inquiry is the freedom fighter Zuby. In one of his previous appearances on this show, the social media superstar and voice of the people argued that the risk of being exposed to disease is just part of being human. But during the lockdown, so many governments around the world seemed to lose their minds, and they conjured up increasingly nonsensical rules to prevent that from happening. And their attempts to cow people into obeying them, well, they're still having repercussions today. So, Zuby, throughout the pandemic, you've called out regulations which make absolutely no sense whatsoever. So as part of this lockdown inquiry, I want to know why you think we all agreed to change our behaviour in these ways without proof that it was doing anything.
Hey, Dan. Well, I think the biggest factor at play is fear. I think that there's no emotion, there's no power that controls human beings and enables a party to control them, such as fear. Whether that fear is real, imaginary, manufactured, exaggerated, it doesn't matter. And I think when it comes to this, we're really talking about multiple fears here. So I think early on, there was clearly a lot of fear about the virus itself, about fear of death, fear of illness, fear of infection. Totally understandable. However, I think another major part that it was playing a role and is still playing a role, in fact, is the fear of social ostracization or social judgment. As much as human beings are somewhat individualistic, we are also very much herd animals. And a lot of rules and policies and norms are enforced by whether or not you are conforming with the majority. So I think when it comes to a lot of policies, for example, many of the masking policies, I don't think, especially at this stage, with many people, it's not the virus that they are overly concerned about. They are simply trying to avoid conflict, or they are trying to conform and fit in with the majority of people. And I think it's hard to overstate just how important these social factors are. But if I could sum it up in one word, I would say fear.
No, I think you're right. I think you're completely right. Now, look, I want to examine now some of these completely bonkers rules. So actually, you've picked your top 10, which were imposed on at least one country's citizens. So I'll run through them and then you can talk at the end, Zuby. So number 1, mandatory masks outdoors. Number 2, mask shenanigans in restaurants, because, of course, the virus won't spread when you take your mask off to eat. Number 3, masks in gyms during workouts. Number 4, I hated this one-way systems in supermarkets and on streets. Number 5, curfews, because, COVID clearly only spreads during the night, right? Number 6, pub rules regarding food and alcohol. So remember the Scotch egg rule in the UK. Number 7, mandatory quarantine after multiple negative tests post-international travel. Number 8, closing gyms for a virus where if you're morbidly obese, you're going to be at far greater risk of death. Number 9, different number limits for recreational and work meetings. And number 10, relentless testing. I mean, Zuby, you are completely right. All of those rules were completely bonkers. And by the way, didn't stop the spread of coronavirus at all.
No, there was that study that came out, I think it was from Johns Hopkins, which said that
yes,
everything from the lockdown to the mandates, even the travel restrictions, had virtually no effect on the actual death rate, which, if you think about these things very logically, and it's not overly surprising. But the thing is that those of us who back in 2020 or early 2021 who were even trying to inquire about these, or who were critical of any policies, it was all, you are anti-science, you want people to die, you want grandma to die, so on and so forth. A lot of emotional blackmail was going on. And I think that was a huge problem. That was a massive, massive problem, because look, some of these rules are just arbitrary and silly, but as we know, there are many, especially the lockdowns and stay-at-home orders, which have very real impacts on people's physical health, people's mental health, the economy. We're now seeing inflation going through the roof, the impact that they've had on children, children's development, number of people missing diagnoses and treatments for things such as cancer. You know, there are other threats in the world besides COVID, and there always have been. There are a lot of people who every year, every day die of all sorts of different things. There are a lot of problems. And anytime you're implementing a policy, you're always talking about trade-offs. So from the very beginning, you know I myself was saying, okay, well, what is the trade-off of these policies? Even if some of these things can be shown to slightly reduce the transmission rate or even the death rate, what does it mean on the flip side of that? And I think that now that people are calmer and calmer heads are prevailing and the fear narrative is not as hysterical as it was in most places, people are now slowly starting to look up and question these things. But it's a shame that those who wanted to do this earlier on were so heavily demonized.
Well, of course, because I guess you look at the really damaging initiatives for society, like closing schools. Well, of course, it resulted in some sort of reduction in the spread of COVID immediately. But actually, in the long term, or even the immediate term, it made no sense, because once schools opened up, Zuby, that's how we actually developed a degree of herd immunity, natural immunity amongst our kids, who are the group of people in society who are at least risk of being seriously impacted by COVID. So it actually made more sense to keep them open.
Mm-hmm. And I think another important conversation that was never had in any country or in any city, really, that I'm aware of, is one that is not so scientifically or medically based, but actually it's a philosophical question. If you think about it, Dan, for the past 2 years, all these countries, we've essentially been running under the notion that COVID is the most important thing, and that reducing transmission, hospitalization, death numbers is the most important thing. It's more important than other forms of threat. It's more important than other deaths. It's more important than civil liberties. It's more important than freedom and basic human rights. It's more important than treating people equally and fairly. It's more important than everything. But that conversation was never had. This is not me denying the threat of COVID. It's simply acknowledging the threat alongside other threats that exist and have always existed throughout this thing.
Yeah.
Now, I'm off the top of my head, I believe that according to the official statistics, somewhere about around 5 to 6 million people worldwide over the past 2 years have died either with or from this disease. I don't know how to split that. However, in the same time frame, about 120 million people have died of everything else. About 60 million people worldwide die every single year. So, of course, 5 million deaths of any source is sad. Every single death is sad. But what's interesting is that people don't frame it. People are not even aware of that number.
Well, you talk about trade-offs. You talk about trade-offs, Zuby. And imagine if we'd said, OK, we're going to focus the entire resource of the world for 2 years to research cancer cures. And we're talking about trading off the lives of our young people, because, of course, very old people who we do care a lot about are disproportionately impacted by COVID. But young people are disproportionately affected by lockdowns. And I think we missed that trade-off. But Zuby, let me just tell you finally, my most bonkers rule was actually in Scotland, where Nicola Sturgeon opened up the pubs and nightclubs so they weren't receiving any form of compensation, but then banned them from playing music. So I was up in Scotland. I went to a nightclub at 11 o'clock. There's about 4 people sitting there because you couldn't stand up either. So we were in a dead, silent nightclub. And I remember asking the bar manager, who was, of course, losing his entire livelihood as a result of this ridiculous rule. And I said, how do you feel about this? And he said, I'm okay, because Nicola Sturgeon's keeping us safe. And I just thought, whoa, that is brainwashing. That is brainwashing, because we were all allowed to be in that nightclub, but we weren't allowed to enjoy it, so it rendered the business useless. And I just thought, for me, that summed up the madness of nanny state COVID regulations.
Wow. I wasn't aware of that rule. I'd heard of some of the no dancing rules. And I know at weddings as well. I went to a wedding and I wasn't allowed to be served a drink unless I was sitting down.
Yeah.
So
that was another one. We had to stay seated.
Yeah, I remember that one.
We had to
stay
seated. But no, Sturgeon banned music in Scotland. And one day, Zuby, the history books are going to call out these leaders who maybe got a lot of kudos at the time. But I think when we look on in many years' time, the likes of Sturgeon and Trudeau and Ardern are going to become enemies and villains of the COVID crisis. But so great to speak to you, Zuby. Thank you for joining us for the Lockdown Inquiry tonight.